Before we dive into these scary stories, make sure to hit that subscribe button if you enjoy true horror content every week. I grew up with hunting. My dad started teaching me from a young age, so I've always loved it. There was something about the crisp air, the solitude, and the quiet that I loved. But that trip changed everything. It started as a typical weekend outing. My buddy Ethan and I had planned to hunt and camp deep in the Black Ridge Forest, a place that was known for its dense trees and excellent game. Other hunters swore by it, saying it was untouched wilderness, but also warned that it was easy to get lost if you didn't stick to the trails. I wasn't worried. I'd hunted all my life and had a decent sense of direction. Besides, Ethan was bringing his high-end GPS, so we were covered. We arrived mid-morning, parked the truck, and began the hike into the woods. At first, everything felt normal. Birds were chirping, leaves were rustling underfoot, the occasional distant rustle of an animal scurrying away from us. The forest was alive, teeming with the kind of sounds you expect in the wild. But as the day went on and we got deeper into the woods, the sounds started to fade. It was subtle at first. Fewer bird calls, less rustling. By late afternoon, the silence was so absolute it felt oppressive. No birds, no wind, no insects. Even our footsteps seemed muted. Ethan joked that maybe we'd walked into some kind of soundproof bubble, but the unease in his voice betrayed his attempt at humor. "It's weird, right?" I said, scanning the trees. "Like, something's watching us." Ethan nodded but didn't say anything. He just adjusted the rifle on his shoulder and kept walking. I tried to shake the feeling, telling myself it was just the unfamiliar stillness playing tricks on my mind. But the further we went, the heavier the silence became. It wasn't just quiet. It felt wrong, like the forest was holding its breath. By the time we set up camp, the tension between us was palpable. Ethan was unusually quiet. His eyes were darting around the tree line as he worked. I wanted to say something to lighten the mood, but the words caught in my throat. It felt like speaking too loudly would attract something. That night, we sat around the campfire in uneasy silence. The fire's crackling was the only sound for miles. I kept glancing into the dark woods, expecting to see a deer or maybe a raccoon, but there was nothing. No glowing eyes, no movement, just the endless, suffocating stillness. "Let's call it a night," Ethan finally said, standing up abruptly. "We'll get a fresh start in the morning." I agreed, glad to have an excuse to crawl into my tent. Sleep came in fits. Every time I closed my eyes, I felt like something was standing just outside the tent, watching me. I'd sit upright, heart pounding, but there was never anything there. Just the silence. Around 3 a.m., I woke to the sound of Ethan unzipping his tent. I peeked out to see him standing by the dying embers of the fire, staring into the woods. "Ethan," I whispered. "What are you doing?" He didn't respond. He just started walking slowly toward the trees. "Hey," I hissed, louder this time. "Where are you going?" Still nothing. I scrambled out of my tent and jogged after him, grabbing his shoulder. He spun around, his eyes were wide with fear. "Did you hear that?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Hear what?" I said, my stomach knotting. The footsteps. Someone was walking around the camp." I stared at him, chills running down my spine. "Ethan, I didn't hear anything." He looked past me, into the dark forest. It came from that direction, slow footsteps. They stopped right at the edge of the camp. "Couldn't you hear me calling for you, Ethan?" I said. He didn't respond. The whole situation was creeping me out. I turned to follow his gaze, but the forest was pitch black. "Let's get back to the fire," I said. "It's probably just an animal." But Ethan shook his head. It wasn't an animal. I didn't know what to say. The fear in his eyes was contagious. We stood there for a moment, staring into the void, before I finally grabbed his arm and pulled him back to the campfire. Neither of us slept after that. We sat by the fire until dawn, clutching our rifles and listening. But the silence persisted. No footsteps, no whispers, just that horrible, unnatural stillness. At first light, we packed up and decided to cut the trip short. Whatever game we'd hoped to hunt wasn't worth this. As we hiked back toward the truck, the forest seemed to close in around us. The trees were denser than I remembered, and the trail felt off. Ethan kept checking his GPS and was muttering something under his breath. "This can't be right," he said. "We should have hit the clearing by now." I glanced around, my unease growing as we were still deep in the forest. "Are you sure the GPS is working?" "It's working," he snapped, but he sounded unsure. "We're going the right way." But we weren't. We walked for hours, and the trail only seemed to loop back on itself. Panic started to set in. The silence was unbearable. Then out of nowhere, we heard it. A single echoing snap, like a branch breaking. We froze. The sound came from behind us, but when we turned, there was nothing there. Just the trees. "Let's keep moving," I whispered. We quickened our pace, but the snapping sounds continued, and it sounded like it was following us. It wasn't an animal, I was sure of it. Ethan broke into a jog and I followed, with my heart hammering in my chest. The snapping grew louder, joined by the unmistakable sound of heavy footsteps. They were behind us, closing in. "Run!" Ethan shouted, and we sprinted. Someone was definitely following us. I don't know how long we ran. My legs burned and my lungs screamed for air, but the footsteps never stopped. They were right behind us. Finally, after what felt like hours, we burst into a clearing, and there was our truck. Relief flooded through me as I fumbled for the keys. Ethan pulled his weapon out, ready to put whatever or whoever was chasing us down if the need arrived. I unlocked the truck and practically threw myself into the driver's seat. Ethan jumped in beside me, slamming the door shut. As I started the engine, I glanced back at the tree line. For a split second, I thought I saw something. A tall, grayish figure standing among the trees. But then it was gone. We didn't speak on the drive back. Whatever we'd encountered in the silent woods, I never wanted to face it again. And I haven't been back since. Hunting had always been more than a hobby for me. It was tradition, a rite of passage passed down from my grandfather to my father, and now to me. Every autumn, I took a week off work, grabbed my rifle, and headed into the deep woods of Montana. There was something primal and grounding about being out there. Just you, the wilderness, and the hunt. This year, I decided to explore a new area, far from the usual trails. A buddy of mine had mentioned a place called Red Creek Woods. He claimed it was untouched, crawling with game, but warned me it was remote and easy to get lost. That didn't bother me. I loved a challenge. I arrived at the edge of the forest early, just as the sun began to rise. The air was crisp, carrying the earthy scent of damp leaves which I loved. My gear felt solid on my back, and my rifle rested comfortably in my hands. I hiked for hours, deeper and deeper, until I found myself in a part of the woods where the trees grew so thick their branches intertwined. That's when I saw some weird tracks. At first glance, they looked like regular deer tracks. I knelt to examine them more closely. Something was off. The shape was right, but the indentations were unusually deep, like the animal that made them was impossibly heavy. The tracks were dotted with dark smears of blood, leading into the denser part of the woods. I stood up, gripping my rifle tighter. Injured deer meant an easy kill, but the sight of those bloody tracks filled me with unease. Still, curiosity won out, and I began to follow them. The deeper I went, the stranger the forest felt. The air felt heavier, colder, and the usual forest sounds had completely vanished. All that remained was a scary silence, broken only by the crunch of leaves under my boots and the occasional drip of what I hoped was dew falling from the branches above. Usually when the forest goes silent, it means there is a predator nearby, but this part of the forest wasn't supposed to have any predators, so I continued. After half an hour of tracking the deer, I came to a small clearing. In the center stood a deer. It was tall, too tall. It stood perfectly still in the middle of the clearing. Its antlers were massive in their size, and its body was huge but also skinny, like it hadn't eaten in weeks. But what froze me in place wasn't its appearance. It was the way it was standing. The deer was upright, balanced on its hind legs like a person. Its forelegs dangled awkwardly in front of it. It didn't move, didn't blink. It just stared at me. I should have turned around and left right then, but something about the creature held me in place. I raised my rifle, aiming at the strange, unnatural animal. My finger hovered over the trigger. And then it spoke in the most haunting voice I have ever heard. Leave. It didn't sound human, but it didn't sound like any animal I'd ever heard either. I stumbled back, nearly dropping my rifle. The deer, or whatever it was, tilted its head, its black, glassy eyes locked onto mine. Leave, it said again in that haunting voice. I turned and ran. I didn't care where I was going, didn't care about the gear I left behind. I just needed to get as far away from that thing as possible. In the distance, I could hear something running towards me. Whatever it was sounded like a large creature. I panicked. I full well knew that it was the deer that was sprinting towards me. I glanced over my shoulder and immediately regretted it. There was the deer running after me. Its head twitched and tilted as it ran, as if it was studying me, enjoying the chase. My boot caught on a root, and I went down hard. The wind knocked out of me. I scrambled to get up. The footsteps were closer now. I turned onto my back, raising my rifle just as the creature stepped into view. It loomed over me. Up close, I could see its skin wasn't right. It was stretched too tightly over its bones, and the patches of fur it had were matted and stained. Its face was wrong, didn't look like any deer I'd ever seen before. The snout was too short, the teeth too sharp. It leaned down, its rancid breath washing over me. "You don't belong here," it growled. I fired. The shot echoed through the forest, and the creature let out an ear-splitting screech. It stumbled back, clawing at its side, but it didn't fall. Instead, it straightened, its black eyes now filled with rage. I didn't wait to see what it would do next. I scrambled to my feet and ran. The footsteps followed for a while, but eventually they faded, replaced once again by that oppressive silence. I didn't stop running until I was out of the woods and into the clearing where my truck was parked. I jumped in, started the engine, and tore out of there without looking back. I'm the kind of guy that likes to be alone, so the forest always had a way of calming me. There was something about the crunch of leaves underfoot, the cool air, and the scent of pine that cleared my mind. Hunting trips were my escape. Just me, my rifle, and the wild. That's how it had always been. However, this time turned out to be different. I'd read stories about this particular stretch of woods online. It was a remote, sprawling area miles from any road or cabin. People called it the Old Grove. Hunters said it was teeming with deer and elk. But they also said it was strange, that something about it didn't feel right. Some even claimed they felt like they were being watched. I didn't believe in campfire tales, so I decided to see it for myself. I parked my car at the edge of the woods just before dawn and started the hike in. The forest was alive and beautiful. It felt like any other hunt. For hours I wandered, scanning for tracks, listening for movement. By midday I found them, hoofprints in the soft earth, leading deeper into the forest. They were fresh. Excitement coursed through me as I followed the trail. The tracks led to a small hill, and there it was, a massive buck. Its antlers were wide and beautiful, a true trophy. It stood perfectly still in the center of the clearing, its back to me. I raised my rifle, steadying my aim. That's when it turned its head. Its eyes were wrong. They weren't the dark liquid eyes of a deer. They were pale, milky, and they locked onto mine with an unsettling intensity. A shiver ran down my spine, but I shook it off. It was just an animal, nothing more. I exhaled slowly, my finger tightening on the trigger. The buck turned and ran into the woods, cursing under my breath. "You should have taken the shot," I mumbled to myself. I slung my rifle over my shoulder and went after it. The thrill of the chase took over. After a while, I slowed down, looking around. The buck's tracks were still there. They were larger now, deeper. I followed the tracks to a small ridge overlooking a ravine. At the bottom, I spotted it. The buck, lying still. Its body was twisted, the legs bent. Blood pooled around. But something wasn't right. The wound, if there was one, wasn't visible. It was as if the life had been sucked out of the animal, leaving behind a hollow shell. I felt a knot form in my stomach. I should have left right then. But instead, I climbed down into the ravine to investigate. When I reached the buck, I knelt beside it, studying it closely. The fur was matted and coarse, the body cold to the touch, which would indicate that it had been there for a while. Then I heard it. A twig snapping behind me. I spun around, raising my rifle. There was nothing there. Just the trees. Another snap, this time closer but behind me again. "Who's there?" I called out. No answer. The forest remained silent. "I'm not here to steal your game," I yelled. I turned back to the buck, but it was gone. The bloodstain was still there, fresh and glistening, but the body had vanished. My pulse quickened as I scanned the ravine. There was no way something had dragged it off that quickly, not without making a sound. Then I saw them, tracks leading away from the bloodstain. But they weren't hoofprints anymore. They were footprints, bare, human-like footprints. I backed away. My body was filled with adrenaline. The forest felt oppressive now. The air was suffocating. I clutched my rifle, every instinct screaming at me to leave, and then I heard it. A low growl, echoing through the trees. It didn't sound like any growl I'd ever heard before. Not a bear, not a wolf. It was something else. The growl turned into a snarl, and then I saw it. A figure emerged from the shadows. Its limbs were long. It had the head of the buck, but its body was almost human. Its pale, milky eyes were locked onto mine, and it smiled. A grotesque, toothy grin that sent a wave of cold terror through me. I ran as fast as I could, but I forgot my rifle in my panic. I glanced back and saw it standing at the edge of the ravine, watching me. It didn't chase me further. It just stood there. I didn't stop running until I reached my car. I slammed the door and locked it. My hands were shaking with fear as I started the engine. I couldn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, those pale, haunting eyes flashed in my mind. By morning, I tried to convince myself it was just exhaustion, that my mind had been playing tricks on me. But deep down, I knew better. It wasn't just my imagination. In the days that followed, I did some digging online, desperate for answers. That's when I stumbled upon something chilling. The creature I encountered matches the descriptions of what people call a skinwalker. According to Navajo folklore, a skinwalker is a malevolent being capable of shape-shifting into animals or mimicking the voices and appearances of people to lure its prey closer. They are predators in the most terrifying sense of the word. I still feel a shiver run down my spine every time I think about it. I was lucky I got out of there alive.